The Christians and Christian fundamentalists always tell me that I need to read the words of Jesus himself. But what if those words are proven incorrect? Stay with me as this contention not only debunks Christian fundamentalism, but Christianity itself. Now, when looking for the legitimacy of Yeshua as being who he said he was, we look at the writings of his words himself, which of course calls into question of what the Gospels say he said as being accurate to begin with. For the Westar Institute, in their over decade-long investigation of the matter, with many non-biased New Testament scholars, conclude that 80% of what Jesus supposedly said in the New Testament, he most likely didn't say at all. And of course, that's a great matter of debate. But let's just assume what the Gospels state did come from Yeshua himself. What if he was incorrect in what he was saying? For a person who was divine, a branch from the tree of God himself, would not say things that are inaccurate. And this is interesting because I didn't catch this the first 2 times I actually read the Bible from cover to cover. The Bible can be very dry and very drawn out, and it's very easy to fall into a zone and just simply read the words without really contemplating them. But only about a year ago did I really think about this when reading the Gospels portraying Christ's words himself. And this revelation did not move me towards those baptismal waters for reconversion. And this is not just for fundamentalist Christians, but this revelation should make all Christians uneasy about their belief systems. Because many Christians with common sense believe that the Old Testament was largely symbolic, which would be a correct way of thinking, since we have overwhelming evidence that the creation myth is nothing more than that, a myth, and that Noah's global flood simply didn't happen. When I was a Christian, I did not believe that there was an Adam and Eve, nor a Cain who slew Abel. And it seems that God would know this too. And many Christians are starting to realize, as do many Jews, that the Moses Exodus story was a myth as well. Historical record and archaeology does not back that the Hebrews were globally enslaved and escaped from Egypt by crossing a Red Sea that parted and then proceeded to wander in the wilderness for 40 years. Most Christians do not believe these myths of the Old Testament. We know they're fictitious, and it seems that God would know they're fictitious as well. But what happens when God's Son is referring to these myths in his teaching? For instance, in the book of Luke, he speaks of the law of Moses. He talks about the sign of Jonah, and the sign Jonah became to the Ninevites. He also talks about the blood of Abel being spilled. Also in the Gospels, more than once, Peter, James, and John were apparently taken to a mountain by Yeshua, where Moses and Elijah appeared. In Luke, he makes reference to Noah, and it can't be metaphorical because what he says is, quote, "Just as in the days of Noah, so it will be in the Son of Man," unquote. He is stating there were days of Noah, and the floodwaters are mentioned in these Gospels. In Luke, he talks about the destruction of Sodom. In Mark is the mentioning of how God spoke to Moses in a burning bush. In John, he refers to Moses not giving bread to his people, which would have been manna, but from the Father from heaven. And in Luke and John, he speaks of Moses' writing. And these are just some of the examples of reference to Old Testament in the New Testament, many of them coming from Yeshua himself. And this is a huge problem for those who claim that Yeshua was divine. Now, there are many little small nails that are shutting the lid on the coffin in terms of making me believe that Yeshua was who he said he was, as the literal Son of God. The fact that nothing was mentioned about him until 30 to 40 years after his crucifixion, and the fact that the first documentation of Yeshua's life we have was well over a century after his death. All of that screams urban legend. It seems that out of the 500 witnesses that he supposedly reappeared to after his death, no one documented it with authorship as being there to witness this fabulous feat. The contradictions in the Gospels are other small nails in the coffin. But it is possible that there were 500 witnesses and that it was carried through oral tradition until it was finally written down, and it is possible that copyists got it right later. I'm not sure I would believe it is probable, but it is possible. And it is possible that different writers may have made small mistakes, such as mistakes on who actually was at the empty tomb to begin with, whether it was actually an angel at the tomb, and things of the like. To me, it certainly screams urban legend that was manifested over the decades, but I can't completely prove that it didn't happen. But this new revelation I had is a big nail in the coffin for believability in the divinity of Yeshua. Now, for the fundamentalists, this is no problem, because they do believe that Moses existed, that Jonah was swallowed by a whale, which would have been what a big fish was in their language at the time. They do believe there was a Cain and Abel, and that Cain did kill Abel, and they do believe that there was a literal Adam and Eve. They believe that the Red Sea parted, and there was an Exodus that lasted 40 years in the wilderness, as well as a Sodom and Gomorrah that was destroyed by fire. So Jesus quoting these characters and events presents no problem for the Christian fundamentalist. But the problem is that is a cult mentality, because these things have been overwhelmingly proved not to have happened. And if you're still believing Adam and Eve lived to be 1,000 years old and that a global flood covered the earth, then I can't really reach you, and I refer you to my 2 playlists on the matter. But for the rest of the Christians that consider the Old Testament symbolic, you have a huge problem, because Yeshua isn't mentioning these events and characters metaphorically in the Gospels. He is stating them as if these characters existed and these events occurred, and he had Moses and Elijah appear on a mountain to 3 of his apostles. And the problem is there's no evidence whatsoever that a Moses existed, and there's other variations of the tale of Moses in other cultures. We know from archaeological study that the Exodus for 40 years of wandering in the wilderness did not happen. We know from extensive study of Egyptian records that there is no mention of the Hebrews being globally enslaved, although I'm sure that some Hebrews were slaves, such as in the city of Avaris, where they have found small archaeological indications that seem to point to this, but not on a global level. As a matter of fact, one Christian article tried to parallel Jesus' life with the actual Exodus. The Israelites passed through the sea and Yeshua passed through the waters of baptism. The Israelites wandered 40 years and Jesus wandered 40 days while being tempted by the devil. Moses went up on a mount and Jesus gave the Sermon on the Mount. Moses, through the workings of God, fed the people with manna, and Jesus fed the multitudes with bread and fish. And this parallel is entirely debunked because we know that this Exodus never happened to the Israelites. And then he mentions a Noah that never existed, and the flood waters that never occurred. And unless you're an acting cult member, you will understand that we know this for a fact. All the genres of science have proven this. And the evidence is again overwhelming. Just as the evidence is overwhelming that Adam and Eve didn't live to be almost 1,000 years old. And I can't believe that I didn't make this connection decades ago, the first time I read the Bible through cover to cover. Because the man Yeshua was brought up in Jewish tradition. There is good correlating reason to believe this, and is consensus with most scholars. But if he's mentioning all these characters and events that didn't exist and didn't happen, it means that his teachings are based on error. It would highly point to the fact that he was a Jewish man, possibly a rabbi, and he is quoting Jewish doctrine. And the fact that he mentions all these events and people that didn't happen and didn't exist can only lead us to one of 2 logical conclusions. Either he didn't say all of this, which tells us the New Testament is completely inaccurate, or he did say all these things, which means he was in error. And if he's in error, then he's not divine. So this is a perfect example of what happens when you continue to research the legitimacy of Yeshua as being a divine being. I've always said that I'm hoping one day I can prove myself wrong and head to those baptismal waters of reconversion. This revelation not only shoved me the other way, it has pushed me off the cliff of the land of Christianity altogether. And if you'd like to see some more about the debunking of the so-called resurrection, click on my playlist card at the end of the video. And check out my own tale, which at least I admit is fiction, The Second Fall, an offbeat Armageddon sure to offend the evangelical, and probably a few others. Link is on the video description as well as a channel banner, and I will see you next time as we once again take that sword of reason and reality and shove it right through the heart of ignorance.